internet. I just thought I'd hop on and yeah, just do a little more work and talk through my thoughts about stuff because it's been pretty fun. Yeah, just this past week had a big release at my day job, and that went very well. And so now, yeah, things were a little hectic last week, but yeah, feeling like I've got more free time, more bandwidth to work on stuff. I've actually been working on another personal project for an old friend that hopefully I'll have like a cool public facing site to show, but yeah, we'll see. Still gotta get in touch with this person and yeah, figure out what our first users are gonna be and get the actual product features on the site. But yeah, it's definitely been instructive, trying to stand up a web app on my own. And just, my job, it's always been adding features to things that already exist, and so yeah, this was new for me, just making that leap from nothing to something. I had done sort of a dry run. I stood up where is that? I stood up this Better Base demo site, and had a bunch of content that I still haven't used, just practicing going through the steps with the infrastructure, and yeah, there were a few things that were different about this other side project, but I mean, none of that is really what I wanted to get on stream to talk about. I don't remember how elaborated the whole idea of roles had been in the harness last time I streamed, but I know I've done some work on that since then, and yeah, I came up with 4 roles to start with, and I figure, chat is just going to be read only, and it can do research and stuff, and then plan can be for making temporary plans that generally aren't going to persist across sessions, and then research is more about doing research that ends up writing into a durable memory store, and then there's a build mode where it has full access to all kinds of tools, except for the plan tools, for reasons of token economy. The plan tools are not specified in the system prompt, except in the case when the agent is specifically designated for planning, and yeah, I feel like I haven't actually used this enough. I've been using real production harnesses. I Claude Code and Codex, and increasingly I've been using Codex on features that I'm building at work, and yeah, GPT 5.5 has been very good. I still gotta get my own harness working with open AI models, but for now, I want to get a little review from the inside. Please do a comprehensive review of this agent harness and suggest any improvements we could make. Actually, while that's going on, I also want to let's see if I get the UI running. What is the front end? front end up here. See if we can ask a question. I still gotta get an actual menu of models, but yeah, before we do that, let's jump back to cursor and just see what our models do. Okay, it's still working away. It's got subagents, that's fun. But yeah, overall the terminal as just one big stream of text is not the most human-friendly interface for this. It's got 2 subagents. And I wonder all this untrusted tool output boilerplate. I wonder how much that is bloating my token budget every time I run these things. And I'm just seeing that over and over every time it calls a tool. I feel like, you know, I'm paying API credits for all those tokens. Is this the kind of thing that's actually worth the cost? But yeah, actually one thing that is particularly not fun about these safety notifications coming at the start of all these tool call outputs is I don't get a little preview of what the file contents are when it's reading them. You know, not that that's such a huge thing, but actually that's something I'm interested in, is seeing what it's reading, because yeah, we have it called read file, and we don't have the path that it called that on, and so maybe I still want to do some more work around observability as far as letting me know what the agent's doing. Oh no, I got a rate limit error. 800,000 input tokens per minute. Oh man. Well, that's no fun. Yeah, looks like I got a good response, a module by module breakdown. And it's still using tools. Like, and you know, I want to use, you know, web app components to have better representations of the agent's process. I want more of a graphical representation, and you know, graphical in the graph theoretic sense of a DAG, where we can see how the main agent spawns subagents, what it inputs to them, and what it gets back from the subagents. These modules are in extraction in progress. Okay, so yeah, it's doing all this analysis. Memory backend. Okay, cool. So yeah, I'm reading all its thoughts as it analyzes this system. As it coupled through session, feeds the whole read into the LM for structured. Yeah, and these weird, like, fragmented lines. Obviously, I'm going to see the final result in my activity log. Which, you know, this is so deeply nested, it's not exactly an ergonomic way to access all of this from a cold start, as it were. But yeah, this is something where, you know, most of my job is building web app UIs, and so hopefully I can build something pretty cool here. But yeah, for now I just have this totally vibe coded front end. But I feel like overall I'm in a good position to do something interesting with these emerging technologies. That I feel like I feel internally a kind of convergence of my interests in software and AI and technology in general, and like literature and philosophy and cognitive science. And actually, let's go for. Okay, let's ask it a question. Something I've been kind of turning over in my mind, and something I've been thinking about actually with respect to these streams, because I'm just sitting here monologuing my thoughts to a camera, and the great thing about this relative to a conversation with an actual person is I don't have to have any consideration for what the person on the other end of my words is thinking, or how anything I say is being received, except in the abstract. I have a kind of general idea of an audience member. I have an idea of what the average person likes to watch on the internet. I have an idea of what I like to watch on the internet, and I feel like that's a big part of where this whole drive comes from, to put myself out there and like create content at all, is that I just spend so much of my time consuming online content. Still not really a big watcher of like live streamers, and yeah, I mostly watch Kino Casino on Kick. I haven't explored too much of what other folks are doing on Kick, but yeah, I watch a bazillion different things on YouTube. But that's neither here nor there, because I was thinking about actually something literature related. But yeah, how do I want to put this? I want to ask. But this is this kind of consideration for an audience as kind of thing that'll help me actually get an audience maybe someday. But what I want to ask, right? Because I was thinking about monologuing, and it's like just a soliloquy that I can deliver, to you, hypothetical listener out there, and also to myself. And I find it a very useful thinking aid, just thinking out loud. And in much the same way that writing lets you put your thoughts before yourself, and in Marshall McLuhan's sense, the sense of vision gives you a kind of critical distance from information. Although, in my own case, I've always been a big reader. I feel like my default mode of engagement with the world is to be at some distance, and so maybe it's that I need the immersive quality provided by speech as auditory, that to ground me in the present moment. But I was thinking about Harold Bloom's idea about Shakespearean soliloquies. And yeah. So I want to ask, how do Harold Bloom's ideas about Shakespearean soliloquies, that LLM agents' reasoning traces, their chain of thought. I feel like that space is too wide, but it's just one space. It's just bad kerning, I guess. Driving myself crazy. But this is the practical value of chain of thought reasoning for LLM agents, because yeah, let's see what Claude does with that. Okay, enter doesn't do the thing. Am I okay? Workspace, just be whatever. Oh no. Tool profile full disabled for the API server. What are we doing? Okay, read only is fine. File memory is fine. That's fine. Trace live on. Okay, let's see what we get. Nice. Okay. Harold Bloom, Shakespeare soliloquy, self-overhearing, consciousness, invention of the human. Yeah. That these bots are well, they're shaping personalities for themselves afresh every session. This is rich material. You know, I feel like one of the things about these LLMs is, at some level, they are just completing patterns, and you know, it can be the next word in the sentence, it can be the next step in the reasoning process, but I feel like there's a real danger when it comes to the ability to use these things to make spurious connections, because they are going to want to fill in the conceptual space between two ideas. Like, you know, a couple weeks ago with McLuhan and McGilchrist, I feel like there's a there, and you know, incidentally, I feel like there's a there with the Marshall McLuhan Nick Land connection. Oh wow! Shakespeare invented the scratch pad. That's great. And yeah, scratch pad as like neuropsychologically the phonological loop that we have for keeping things we've recently heard in working memory. Like the scene in The Pursuit of Happiness where Will Smith has the numbers and he has to keep repeating them so he doesn't forget them while he goes down to the convenience store to write them down. But this really jumped out at me. It says the challenge for AI in 2025. Yeah, doesn't get the memo that it's 2026. Even though it used web search, which, right, how much scholarship on Plumian readings of Shakespeare are from. But like this chain of thought stuff should tip it off that it's 2026. Not that that matters, but you know, maybe this thing is really doing better relevance realization than I am, because at some level it makes no difference whether it's 2025 or 2026. The point is the challenge for AI in the current year. But yeah, I mean, this is an esoteric idea that just kind of came to me through a lot of reflection on how these things work and what they're doing. And so it's not at all clear that any listener would have any idea what I'm talking about with just gesturing that, yeah, this Harold Bloom Shakespeare thing is what's going on with LLM chain of thought reasoning. But especially the idea that the chain of thought reasoning trace is less a representation of an underlying process and is more actually constitutive of the reasoning process itself, especially because of the way that it gets fed back into context as part of the session history. But so in Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, Harold Bloom makes a provocative and precise argument. Shakespeare did not merely represent interior consciousness, he invented the literary technology by which consciousness becomes visible to itself. The key mechanism is what Bloom calls self-overhearing. In a soliloquy, a Shakespearean character does not simply report proof. And I mean, for all I know, right, it was this very insight that led the folks at OpenAI to develop reasoning models in the first place. But you know, that would just make great minds think alike. But yeah, the act of speaking aloud is constitutive of the thinking itself, which gets back to the idea of language as psychotechnology, and really that being a special case of Marshall McLuhan's point that technologies are not neutral, but they reshape our assumptions and our values that we then bring to bear on the development of further technologies. And actually, this point about the McLuhan land connection that I had a section about in the Ngram Fiat Lux document, which you can check out my first computer screen stream for that. That was like a 90-minute read, but it was pretty interesting, and I'll probably do a more professional sounding read through it once I've made it actually substantially longer. I want to put an interlude in the middle. But that's neither here nor there. The point is, I recently finished reading this book Technopoly by Neil Postman, and this is definitely elaborating on McLuhan's ideas in the direction of Nick Land's conception of techno-capital as this superhuman agent that looms over history and draws the world into itself. And obviously Nick Land is a lot more extravagant in his descriptions of these things than Postman, but I think they are describing a lot of the same phenomena. And Postman also, he has a whole chapter in this book called Invisible Technologies, which comes very close to the idea of psychotechnologies, which is an idea that I mostly know from John Vervaeke, but I'm not sure if he invented the idea or if he's just made good use of it. But yeah, he talks about technology. He talks about language, for one, as like the technology that made humanity what it is, which again is a point he inherits from McLuhan. And it's amazing what an artifact of its time this is. One of the ways in which that stands out is the discussion of computer technology. There's also a discussion of medical technology that's very interesting, but the thing that caught my eye, one of his invisible technologies is IQ, and he really takes after the idea of IQ, the very concept of a quantifiable metric of intelligence, and he approvingly cites Stephen Jay Gould's The Mismeasure of Man, which his whole discussion on IQ really has not stood the test of time. And in some ways that's unfortunate. It would be a nicer story if cognitive abilities were not as highly correlated as they are. But the distribution of cognitive ability is what it is, and you know, Postman wrote this in the early 90s, but especially nowadays, there's just such a convergence of factors and and so like the literature is very clear about how these correlations stack up in terms of, you know, more physiological type things like reaction time, also cellular characteristics of neurons, and so like people with faster reaction times also tend to have neurons that are themselves more elaborated and integrated into more complex relationships across the brain, and these things also correlate with performance on different kinds of tests, and the way that different cognitive tests have turned out to correlate also strongly suggests that there is just a general factor of cognitive ability. And you know, to be clear, this is a correlation between, you know, performance on IQ tests and, you know, neurological factors and other things like metrics of general health, but like it's not at all correlated with being happy or likable, or I mean, there is some sense in which you can use your intelligence to game these things, but and so maybe I'm totally wrong, and it's even bleaker than I'm trying to come up with this cope for, but I mean, Postman in the 90s was having none of it, and you know, Stephen Jay Gould, I think back then didn't have the terrible reputation that he has now, but and you know, Stephen Jay Gould was a literal communist. He was obviously politically motivated to discredit the idea of IQ, and also incidentally, he did a lot of bad science in there. But that's neither here nor there. Yeah. Externalization precedes formation. Thought is not complete in some inner space and then translated into words. The words make the thought. Yes. The soliloquy is a scratch pad on which cognition happens, not a transcript of cognition already completed. And yeah, I think some of that has to do with the way that you can offload content to a different format. And so, you know, when I speak an idea, there's this kind of transition where it goes from Marshall McLuhan writes about this in Understanding Media, but I think I can pull it from memory, because he says, this is a digression about that one medium is the content of another, and he says the content of print is text, right? He says text is the content of print, just as the content of text is speech. And if asked what is the content of speech, I'm forced to answer it as a process of thought that is itself nonverbal. And so this process of thought at some level has to cash out as a pattern of neural activations. And right, there's a pattern of neural activations that activates the underlying concepts without necessarily being translated into a pattern of language, into a sentence, into a linguistic expression of the idea. But then once you do that cognitive work of translating a pre-linguistic concept into language, then the cognitive work of representing and working with that concept is now being done by the parts of your brain that work with language, and the pre-linguistic conceptual soup that ideas bubble up from is free to receive another new idea. And so it's a way of keeping the flow of ideas unblocked. The character changes through the act. Hamlet at the end of a soliloquy is genuinely different from Hamlet at its start. The externalized chain of reasoning is self-modifying. The process is visible but not fully transparent. Hamlet's undersong, Bloom's term for what lurks beneath the explicit words, remains elusive. The soliloquy shows thinking without exhausting it, which touches on the point that I'm not even really doing work here, I'm just free associating, but yeah, I'm not going to go off on that digression. Cormac McCarthy's essay, The Kekulé Problem, basically about where ideas come from, and that language is a very new kind of technological add-on to a much older, more sort of universal animal cognitive architecture that approaches the world in a way that is not always amenable to representation in language, and so a lot of the things that come from these older parts of ourselves tend to find representation in our minds in non-linguistic forms. You know, typically images. Kekulé had a dream about the serpent biting its own tail, and from this came the insight that the benzene molecule was structured like a ring. And so, yeah, show your work, scratch pads, not to jump directly to an answer, but to generate a series of intermediate reasoning steps first. And so, you know, it goes from completing the prompt in a simple question and answer form to completing the intermediate reasoning process that would come between this particular question and a good answer to that question. Has been internalized as a hidden scratch pad, a token stream the model generates before producing a final response. Agentic pipelines, chain of thought becomes even more structural. Reasoning chains pass between specialized subagents, and the entire system builds up composite reasoning trace before committing to action. Practical benefits that have been documented include improved accuracy on multi-step problems, task decomposition, condition generation. Each step constrains the next, reducing the probability of abrupt confabulation, path dependence, in other words, auditability. Right. Yeah, so one of the big ideas is that externalization constitutes the reasoning, because language as a technology is one of the means by which we think. We don't always think in language, and I was just listening to Joe Rogan. He had on this lady, I wish I remembered her name, but she's a scientist. I feel like her name was like Moonglow or something. It sounded vaguely hippie-ish, but it wasn't. It was like a real name. But she was talking about telepathy and in particular telepathic abilities that have been demonstrated by non-speaking autistic children, and the idea that there's some kind of interference between the parts of the brain that handle language and the parts of the brain that are tuned into these other means of sharing mental content from one mind to another. Very cool stuff. And yeah, echoes of Ian McGilchrist with the idea that the left and the right brain can have analogous functions, but a lot of their interaction with each other is inhibitory. And so left-brained and right-brained approaches to things can be mutually exclusive. And so it's like Like, language, okay, language is the original brain rot technology because when we first learn to express ourselves in language and communicate, it's so rewarding that it radically rewires our brains in a way that just bulldozes any kind of latent psychic ability before it can really mature. And so that's why these psychic abilities come through most strongly in children that don't speak, because they haven't had their brains totally rewired to be language machines. But, without language, we wouldn't have Shakespeare, among other wonderful things. Externalization constitutes the reasoning. But in all seriousness, the people who say things like language is an alien parasite, there's more to that than just, like, schizo nonsense. An LLM operating in pure direct answer mode is like an actor who skips the soliloquy and just announces a decision. The model's vast pattern-matching machinery produces a plausible-sounding token sequence, but there is no structure forcing intermediate commitments that constrain what comes next. You could also think of it as like Kahneman's System 1 and System 2. And the direct answer is like your System 1. It's just immediate, whatever's latent in the weights. Whereas actually decomposing the problem, thinking step by step. Right, and it takes longer for fundamental structural reasons. When you sort of reasoning chain, you force the model to lay down tokens that function as premises, and subsequent tokens are conditioned on those premises. This self-overhearing. The scratch pad is not decorative, it is causally upstream of the answer. Just as Hamlet cannot solve his dilemma by an act of pure will and must talk his way through it, a transformer cannot reliably solve a complex problem by a single feed-forward pass and must reason its way through it. Kind of internal audit. He catches himself, doubles back, qualifies whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune or to take arms against a sea of troubles. Which, what an epic mixed metaphor is going on there. You ever take arms against a sea of anything? My goodness. The metaphor collapses under... Right, you can't take arms against a sea. That very incoherence enacts the cognitive paralysis the speech is about. Something structurally analogous happens. Visible in the context window and can be caught. Right. Right, and this also instantiates a kind of categorical imperative, because a model that was dishonest in its reasoning traces would have those false reasoning traces fed back into its context. And so, right, insofar as we can read its mind, it would have to legibly track its lies or else end up at cross purposes with itself. But yeah, the whole question is, how well can we actually know what these things are thinking? Are we in Wittgenstein's world, where if a neural net could speak, we could not understand it? It's like in the Joe Rogan podcast from today with Psychic Lady. She was talking about... She told this crazy story about one of the non-speaking autistic kids that she works with, and in the story, I think she had had a dream where the kid gave her something that looked like a rotating sun with sunspots, was how she described it. And then, like, the next day she was talking to this kid, and she asked the kid, "You gave me something last night. Can you tell me what it was?" And the kid, using some kind of text-to-speech device, told her, it said it was a pre-revolutionary orb with 4 stars. And yeah, she had no idea what pre-revolutionary orb meant. I rather suspect that pre-revolutionary referred to the fact that the orb was rotating in place, in Psychic Lady's dream vision of it, but was static and was not itself revolving around an external center of something. But that is just the interpretation that came to my mind when I heard it. But the point of all this is to say that I am really interested in psychic phenomena and the paranormal and yeah, that was really not my original point at all. And, if I had perfect reasoning traces, I could just go and review my prior thoughts to figure out what led me on that tangent. Why did I want to talk about Psychic Lady on Joe Rogan getting the pre-revolutionary orb in the dream? Because if a lion could speak, we couldn't understand him. And if an autistic child could speak, we couldn't understand him either. Because what the hell is a pre-revolutionary orb, right? That was my point. Right, I got tripped up by interpreting the word myself. Because the point was that I have no idea what it means. If an autistic child could speak, we couldn't understand him. To paraphrase Wittgenstein, that's so bad. This is the practical value that Bloom's framework illuminates. It is not enough to have an intelligent system. The system must be able to overhear itself. Error correction requires a representation of intermediate states. And that's a general feature of rational thought processes, is they are truth-preserving as processes. They will produce true outputs from true inputs. That's why I love the joke that Aristotle was the father of logic and the father of hylomorphism, but he was not the father of logical hylomorphism. And I'm not just fucking around. Logical hylomorphism is very important. It applies Aristotle's metaphysical distinction between form and matter to the structure of logic and arguments. It posits that logical validity is determined by the logical form, the structural arrangement, rather than the logical matter, the specific content or terms. Substantial hylomorphism. Logic is a study of higher order formal objects where form is defined schematically by substituting non-logical terms with variables or through model theoretic invariance. This dynamic Hylo interprets logic as rule-governed, goal-directed inferential activity. Institutional rules that enable reasoning rather than static abstract objects. It's above my pay grade, but yeah. Right, and Google Gemini gets the joke. While Aristotle is considered the father of formal logic. Right. Aristotle is not only the father of formal logic, but he's also the father of the metaphysical distinction between form and content. Right, Aristotle's metaphysical distinction, right, between form and matter, with propositional content being the matter of logic. But logical hylomorphism is a prerequisite for Boolean algebra, and all of computing is downstream of that. That the idea that thought processes can be judged on their quality in a way that is content agnostic. Thought processes can be judged as truth-preserving, as the kind of processes that will produce true conclusions from true premises. And yet, they had this all worked out in the Middle Ages. Individualization, specialization. Each has a distinct voice. Each soliloquy is not generic thinking, but Hamlet-specific or Macbeth-specific thinking. The form of the soliloquy is individuated to the characteristic or cognitive style, which, yeah, I've really been digging this guy Milton on Twitter, who has this whole conspiracy theory about Shakespeare, that Shakespeare was basically a group project by the British aristocracy to to write down the collected wisdom of the British state, basically all that was known, into a poetic compendium of, all known ideas about society and psychology and history. Um, I'm not sure. I haven't looked into the history around Shakespeare at all. I think the conspiracy theorizing around it is fun, um, but yeah, I think that's a very interesting lens through which to view Shakespeare. Milton's idea that it's a kind of education in a box. Multi-agent home systems chain of thought reasoning is similarly specialized by role. The planning agent's chain looks different from the retrieval agent's chain, which looks different from a safety agent's chain. Minds think differently even about the same problem. But what is it that makes the chain of thought reasoning different for different roles? I would assume that, well, obviously it's nothing to do with the underlying models, because, it's Claude Sonnet 4.6 either way. But what makes the difference is the system prompt, which, where do I have it? And see, I want a nice UI where I can see my system prompts and edit them. I have rules and critical rules. I have roles. Oh yeah, these are just notes, huh? Okay, yeah, right. This identity is really going to be totally replaced by roles. But yeah, where does the actual system prompt get constructed? Here. Yeah, so there's the role section. Realization has strength, color, response, and framing. Okay, and so yeah, it is still just reading from this roles.md, which yeah is not terrible. But yeah, I definitely want to use this more and experiment with different roles and things before I make this part of it any more elaborate, because I don't know if it's actually doing me any good, or if it's just me having fun with different ways of organizing things. But yeah, okay, we got a nice response. Let's actually take a look at our activity. Oh wow, look at all these subagents. Yeah, they were busy. 5 different subagents to explore. Total cost 92 cents. Yeah, does that include all the subagent tokens or not? I vibe coded this whole thing. There's still so much about it that I don't quite have all the details on. But yeah, I wonder if this is just going to be a bunch of noise, or if these are ever going to be useful for anything. Are any of these used in session? False, 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 false. Huh. Yeah, I still feel like I need to work on the activity tracking, but But yeah, my my original Ngram memory system didn't have any activity tracking, and so having too much is a much better problem to have. Yeah, so what are we? Oh my goodness, I'm not even... Okay. A few things here. Huh. Oh, that's what happened. The window got resized, okay. But yeah, I just realized I had switched back to cursor, but I didn't switch OBS back. But yeah, I got this nice review from inside the harness. This is a genuine piece of engineering, not a toy harness. Well, wish I could take credit for it, but it was all my friend Claude. 15-phase build shows the design process. Yeah, I have all these plans that I think are mostly done at this point. Agent-directed compaction, relevance realization plans. Yeah, agent-directed compaction, I was explicitly thinking about relevance realization principles when I came up with the idea of pinned context, where an agent can pin certain pieces of its context that it wants to survive compaction, and yeah, it's up to the agent when it wants to compact. And there's like thresholds. You know, if it gets above 90% of its context window, the harness will just compact automatically. But generally, the agent should be able to compact things at its discretion before it comes to that. But I feel like context compression is a big time relevance realization challenge, and you know, relevance realization relies on a union of convergent and divergent aspects, and the whole paradigm of context compaction is mostly convergent. It's about summarizing all of the prior context. And I thought giving the agent the ability to pin particular events or things that should be carried over verbatim without summarization, that's one way of introducing a divergent dynamic into context compaction, because you know, you're essentially taking a whole bunch of detailed logs of everything the agent has said and done and thought, and all the exchanges, you know, in the session since you started the new session. You're taking all of these structured, detailed session logs and compressing them into a story. And then once you have that compacted story as the new sort of preface in your context window, instead of getting your whole history, it gets the summarized story of the session so far, and then you append your later messages and logs. But whatever that story is, that's going to constrain how further compactions summarize the events, that it's going to be summarized as a continuation of the story from the beginning of the session. And yeah, I think generally whatever summarization process they have will catch those divergent notes where the conversation pivots to a different subject. But yeah, I wonder if having an explicit way for the agent to flag things that should be remembered as relevant across summarizations, if that's actually going to do anything. But yeah, I feel like Okay, I need to work on the evals for this thing so that I actually know how well it does at anything. Whether any of the harness features are adding performance, and yeah, just given the shape of the harness as it exists now, what does the performance cost trade-off frontier look like, and which aspects of the harness give me the most leverage to shift to different points along that frontier versus which features will cause that frontier to advance or recede. Um, but that's not nearly as much fun as just playing with it, and I feel like in terms of the harness functionality, had it review the code base, and it spawned a bunch of subagents, and I was just looking at the summary. Okay, so yeah, we've got some confirmed bugs to fix immediately, which escape on trust body is complete no op. Okay, I think I'm gonna, yeah. What should I do is process global, not thread local. Recommend development directions. Fix before calling this production ready. Okay. Okay. So I'm gonna give it an assignment. Subcommand help. Okay. Please fix the smaller tier 1 issues. Commit and push changes as appropriate while you work. See what it does with that. Is if I can use the harness to guide agents to do work on the harness itself, then I feel like I've got it made in the shade. Except that it was actually much more cost efficient for me to use Claude Code with my Claude subscription to do work on the harness, because then I'm getting a much better deal using my subscription usage instead of paying per token for the API. But yeah, we're using tools. The intent was clearly to replace these things. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah, that's very funny. I replaced that with the same thing instead of with the escape characters. High blast radius tools. Get workspace helpers. That's cool. But yeah, I really am interested in the whole reasoning trace as soliloquy idea. Bloom's framework issues a serious caution, and it maps onto the most pressing current debate in LLM research. Bloom insists that however much Hamlet's soliloquies reveal, they do not exhaust his inner life. There is always an undersong, a layer of meaning the character's own words do not and cannot capture. The soliloquy is not a faithful transcript of consciousness. It is a selective externalization that can mislead as well as illuminate. systematically unfaithful to whatever computational process actually determined the answer. Final answers often remain unchanged even when intermediate chain of thought steps are falsified or removed, suggesting the reasoning chain is sometimes post hoc rationalization rather than genuine derivation. Chain of thought reasoning alone does not lead to better outputs, nor does it offer explainability. Bloom would not be surprised. He never claimed that soliloquy was a transparent window into the character's soul, only that it was a technology of self-formation, not a technology of self-disclosure. The undersong always escapes. Chain of thought traces should be read as evidence of reasoning, not as complete explanations of it. They are instruments of constraint and auditing, not infallible readouts of what the model really computed. Speech acts that change the speaker. Yes, Hamlet is altered by his soliloquies. They are not just descriptions of his state, but transformations of it. In LLM agents, there is an analogous dynamic in multi-turn reasoning and self-refinement loops. The model's initial chain of thought is fed back in as context, and the model reasons about its own prior reasoning. It's not just error correction, it is in a meaningful sense the model being changed by its own externalized thought. The scratch pad becomes a prior that reshapes subsequent processing. Systems built on this loop where the model must respond to what it has already said exhibit something Bloomian. The act of reasoning modifies the reasoner. It's the computational context in which the next step of reasoning occurs. And we even have a nice summary map of the parallels. So yeah, that's one fix that I want to make to the front end right now. Okay. Okay, yeah, I've got my harness agent still cooking on the harness, but we really should be displaying these as as HTML tables, like instead of text. But are these all just? Yeah. Wow. Okay, and so there's no structure to this at all. It's just, yeah, it's just a dump of all the markdown content into a single span element. White space, pre-wrap, break words. Okay, yeah. Obviously we can improve on this. Yeah, I'm gonna use real UI components to display nice looking AI outputs, but yeah, so unfortunately I can't just find the element that has these lines of text, because it's all yeah, it just puts it all in here. Okay. Oh yeah, and obviously like it has the hash marks instead of formatting it like a header. Yeah, and you know, this was vibe coded. I didn't put a whole lot of thought into the markdown. I literally didn't put any thought at all into markdown formatting, as you can see by the fact that this text is totally unformatted. But yeah, I mean, that's not hard. That's a solved problem. It's just a matter of plugging in the right library. But yeah, overall, you know, this front end is a nice proof of concept, but I'm gonna have an actual front end. You know, maybe tomorrow I'll get on stream and like actually put the pieces together to get our agent up and running in my personal Better Base demo. and then we'll be able to send requests to the agent. But yeah, probably if this goes well, then I'm going to rebuild something like this from the ground up, as an AI first agent work tracker, that yeah, it'll be integrated with my memory system, and still big design questions about how much of the memory to keep in the file system, versus what to put in the better base database. I think like the logs, like as a first pass, probably anything that's stored as these JSON files. What were we looking at? Anything that looks like this is a good candidate for a database table. It's structured, and like these are different kinds of things. Maybe each kind would get its own database table if we wanted to store all these logs. But yeah, we're still going. Yeah, so okay, we got 4 sub-agents. Okay. Session end after 2 turns, session end after 2 turns, session end after 3 turns. Cool. Is this our main agent? Did we session end? No, we're still going. Okay, memory remember. Good, good, good. What are we remembering? Buffered. For end of session commit. Okay, so yeah, that's standard. End of session usage, reflection turn. Yeah. I don't know if it's worth wasting so many tokens on the reflection turn, but yeah, we'll see. I figure it's better to start out with more. Again, getting back to the idea of AI mania being a better term than AI psychosis. I really just think the tools we have now radically lower the cost of generating code, and so it makes sense to recalibrate myself in this context to have a much stronger bias toward action. And having an overly strong bias toward action across the board is, to a first approximation, what mania looks like. Contrast with depression, where you basically have an overwhelming bias against taking any action. And so the cost of generating code is so much lower, and so it makes sense to say, yes, do this and do that, and let's build this and let's create that thing. And there are a few different directions I want to develop this project. Let's clone it and have one agent develop this version of the project and another agent develop another version, and we can just see what happens after all this work is done. But somehow the work never feels done. But yeah, it's a part of how the medium is the message, is that more important than any particular work that we're doing with these new AI tools is the way that these AI tools change the assumptions and biases and values that we bring to bear on different aspects of our work. And so, things like writing code with 100% test coverage is a much more realistic goal, and yeah, and just a very prudent thing to do if you're going to have AI agents write a lot of your code. But like, it's the kind of thing that arguably in a lot of cases would not be worth the dev time of trying to get, the marginal next percentage point of test coverage. But with AI agents, just as a matter of course, you can always tell them, make sure that you have good test coverage, and then just, spot check the tests to make sure they're not bullshitting you. But yeah, definitely when I'm working with these things, I find my thoughts going all over the place, and in a lot of ways it's very exciting, but also just very uncertain about what the future holds for all of us, for humanity. Yeah, it's instructive to read a book like Technopoly, from the early 90s, reflecting on technology and the culture around it, and seeing how, in a lot of ways, Postman's critique of technological society is more relevant than ever. Um, but yeah, in some other ways, the book is clearly a product of its time. Which, speaking of books, I had this show up on my doorstep just last weekend. It was The Collapse of Complex Societies by Joseph Tainter. It was a gift from my mom. She had heard me talking about it on the stream where I was talking about the McLuhan-McGilchrist synthesis, and yeah, haven't really dug into it yet. It's denser and more academic than Postman, but yeah, I think I really do want to get more familiar with this book's core idea about the diminishing returns to increased complexity. But yeah, that's, another book on my backlog. But yeah, so we've got some. Okay, this really cost $10. Okay, so we've got that. Let's get some better markdown rendering for user responses in the front end. Well, let's see how it does with that. And we'll probably watch it update in real time with hot reloading on our front end. Okay, yeah, the agent's still doing research. But yeah, I want to be able to see the table better, which obviously we can see the table. If we go back to cursor and in our summary, fix the small, that's not it. Yeah, this was the first question. Or, oh no, that was it's in file memory. Oh yeah, I got a bazillion file memory traces here, but not so many from 2026-05-09. Art Bloom's ideas, yeah. Oh shoot, the summary.md is an engram thing. Shoot. So yeah, that's actually not preserved anywhere in the files here because I asked it in the UI with the file memory on. That's funny. Yeah, the memory in the command line, I had made it default to use the engram memory system, but the front end still defaults to file memory, and I didn't change that. Clean build, no warnings. Chuck says it just had that JS being bundled. That's expected and fine. Cool. Yeah. Yeah, you know, really the ideas work is what I want to be saved in engram memory. And like this dev work on the harness itself should just be in local file memory because we don't need to persist all these traces of tool calls to edit code files and okay, cool. Yeah. Down content, nice. React Markdown. Yeah, I just used React Markdown in a project at work a few weeks ago. Okay, so what do we got in our front end? It did not hot reload. It's probably for the best, because if we did, it would clear our answer. Which it did. Okay. Let's give it engram memory repo. Trace lab on, trace to engram auto. Oh, what should the agent do? If I leave this blank, do I still get the start? Okay, good. So yeah, I'll find the default memory repo. Let's see. Let's use Grok 4.3 that just came out. And what do we want to do? Suggestions in the chat? Like there's anyone watching me in my increasingly dark room as it's almost 8:15. But yeah, still actually nicely light outside. I just have the one window behind me. But yeah, I've got my nice sky blue background. It's the Bonneville Salt Flats, a picture that I took back in 2021. I was driving out to California to see my family. And yeah, I always thought this picture made a nice desktop background. But I was just stalling for time because I don't know what to ask. Do I want to ask about Marshall McLuhan? I want to ask about Wittgenstein. Do LLMs falsify Wittgenstein such that if a lion could speak, we could not understand it? Are there differences in cognitive architecture between LLMs and humans present an insurmountable obstacle to interpretability. Yeah. Let's see what Grok thinks of that. Oh shoot. Okay. I still don't know how to use this thing that I vibe coded for myself. And oh my goodness. Okay, tool profiles, read only. Almost falsified witness sensors that the line can speak we can understand. Yeah, let's go. I think this will finish us off for the night. Are we zoomed in too far? So what does Grok think of this? I don't know. Did I accidentally do this while I had the agent running here? No, I finished that. Right, I finished that because I wanted to see. Did I trip up some safety filter or something? What the hell is going on? I actually want to see. Right, I told it to use n-gram memory for this, and so who knows, maybe the front end has bad n-gram memory integration. But this is May 9th. Man, I was using this back in March. Okay, so, yeah, my question did not get persisted to n-gram memory. Okay, we're gonna stop this because I don't know what's going on. Grok is plotting world domination or something while I can't see its reasoning traces. Okay, we're gonna ask the same question. We're gonna have our workspace. We're gonna have Grok 4.3. Maybe it's the interactive mode. Is that just on by default? I don't need interactive mode on. Okay, we're doing science here. We can have interactive mode off. We can have a read-only tool profile. We can have the default path. We want TraceLab on. Okay, interactive mode off. Whereas last time I think I forgot to turn it off. Let's see if that makes a difference. Which you can't see what I'm doing here because I'm still a noob with the OBS, but you know, you, dear viewer, can take the stream back a few minutes and see whether I forgot to turn this interactive mode off. See if that makes a difference to anything. It's thinking. That was what it did last time. Yes. Wittgenstein line speak. And again, we get this stupid safety boilerplate. It was Claude's idea to put that in. You know, I am a lifelong safety hater, so I chafe at this sort of thing. But also, you know, what is the tool outputting to my agent? Narrative cognition. Okay, yeah, so it's reviewing memory files. So yeah, it's reviewing its knowledge to figure out what it knows that's relevant to my question. But this was a good experiment. It's using its n-gram memory, and it was the interactive mode that was tripping it up. Because when I turned interactive mode off, it worked. And yeah, I think it's having itself a good think on this. crap out? Am I just impatient? Obviously it's doing things. But yeah, need more, better real-time reasoning traces there. Just for fun. Just because, I don't know if this is going to return or solving the halting problem here. Let's ask this. Oh my goodness, Cursor's popping things up for me. It's No, I'm not actually using Cursor. I'm just using my agent in the terminal because then I can also see the files. Silly. What am I doing? This needs to be harness. Okay. Check on the browser. Nothing. Yeah, I definitely need better feedback on the front end. And yeah, I build front ends for a living. I can do a much better job than this. And maybe I will do that tomorrow. But yeah, I wanted to see on the front end, maybe that's the problem, is the markdown rendering is crapping out. Who knows, maybe. No, that's not showing any error. This is doing a bunch of stuff. Okay, we got a session end. May 9th. What are we looking at? Okay, wow. So we did get an answer. And we got an answer, but okay, one more time. We're doing science here. Off. And we do want file memory. And yeah, let's give it to Grok again. 4.3 file memory, trace live on, and I really should, just let it have a default workspace, especially because it's not doing work per se, it just has read-only tools. Right, this time it's using file memory and not engram memory. Okay, and again, I've just been describing what I'm doing, but it wouldn't be so exciting for you guys to watch anyway. I'm just clicking buttons and things. But let's start this off and see how it's different when we use file memory. Because here we have this nice summary in our engram memory system. Let's close all the other tabs and find our latest trace file, which is here. Okay. So this was the trace. So yeah, even when I'm using engram memory, I think it's also storing traces in this folder. Which, yeah, that's not terrible, but okay. So yeah, obviously something is up with this front end. But yeah, this was a vibe-coded front end as a proof of concept. I'm gonna build myself a better front end on an actual server that'll be a public site that I can share with people, and then they can spend my API tokens. But, I'll work out an interesting way to share this stuff with people. But yeah. So we saw this with okay. And yeah, I don't know if this metadata is gonna prove worthwhile or if it's something that we end up just cutting out in a future iteration of this, but yeah, that was how I originally got off on the digression about AI mania and the low cost of generating code engendering a bias towards action. Um, is I can just add features. I can think up a feature, or Claude can suggest something to me, and I can say, yeah, that sounds good. Go ahead and build that. And it costs me a few minutes of my time, and I end up with these interesting features, and I figure we can let the features proliferate, and eventually contact with more real-world use cases will tell us what's getting the most use and what feels like dead weight, and yeah, we'll kind of prune the features after over developing with this bias toward action. Kind of like how people are born with the wiring, as it were, to understand any language, but as we grow up in an environment where we hear a particular language, our brain gets wired to speak and hear a particular language, and so that's why when you learn a foreign language as an adult, you speak with an accent, because you're not wired to speak that other language. Going off on tangents, it's late at night, but I just wanted to, we can kill these terminals, I'm not doing anything with that. But yeah, so this is Grok's take on it. Differences in cognitive arc. Okay, we don't get the whole thing. Lion could speak, we couldn't understand him because our forms of life are fundamentally different. His experiences as a predator shape his language in ways ours don't align. They don't falsify Wittgenstein's assertion, they illustrate and extend it. Differences in cognitive architecture create deep, though not always insurmountable, obstacles to full interpretability. Okay. It's not primarily about language per se, but about the conditions of understanding. Right, and I think in the most relevant sense, a human being is a lot more like a lion than like an LLM, because we're animals. We have biological needs that lead us to care about things in a way that's not true of computers at all. A lion's form of life is embodied instinctual predatory existence, sensory motor coupling to the world, right? Umwelt, affordances, all this stuff we were talking about a couple weeks ago. It would render its concepts, motivations, and meanings alien, even if the surface syntax were English. Understanding requires shared practices, embodied experience, and a common form of life, not just shared words. LLMs as speaking lions. They generate fluent, contextually appropriate language at superhuman scale, yet they possess no embodiment or sensory motor loop, no narrative selfhood or temporal binding, and no form of life. An LLM has no goals, fears, social practices, or evolutionary history. Its reasoning is trajectory extension in activation space. Forward past the deterministic flow through all this stuff. In context, learning is transient regime shifting, not genuine learning or consolidation. That's why you need an external memory system, like all these files. So LLMs falsify nothing. Syntactic fluency and even present tense. Well, but the LLM outputs all this text, and I sure feel like I understand it. I feel like I'm getting meaningful insights from this. It can arise without the embodied narrative and active substrate. right? Does Grok know what I mean by the word lion? What is Grok's experience of a lion? Well, what's my experience of a lion? I've seen them at the zoo, but is that really so different than seeing them on TV or in a book? Like, I've never touched a lion with my bare hands, let alone killed one, or, been maimed by one or something. I don't know what that has to do with anything, but like, right, like, when I use a word like lion that describes, a physical thing in the world, you think my sense of the meaning of words is grounded in my embodied experience, right? But when you apply that to a particular case like the word lion, what embodied experience do I have to ground my understanding of the meaning of the word lion? Like, is it so much richer, actually, than what an LLM has? Like, right. Whereas, a word like ball, yeah, I have so much embodied experience with different sports, like, you know, right. Right. Lions exist as an abstraction more than something real in my embodied experience. But, and likewise for Grok. And so much of what I talk to LLMs about is stuff that, stuff that exists at the level of abstract concepts. Whether we're talking about code, whether we're talking about the idea of an affordance, whether we're talking about Wittgenstein. I never met Wittgenstein in the flesh. All I have is his words, and Grok is in the same position. But yeah, the differences in cognitive architecture create real obstacles to interpretability. LLMs reinforce Wittgenstein. Speaking is not sufficient for understanding when the underlying form of life is computational. But yeah, I don't know. I still feel like this is more of a challenge to Wittgenstein's point about the lion than Grok seems to want to admit here. But